everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the next session inside the EU-Obsoleta Data Forum. We titled it Why FAIR is Not Enough, because of our experiences with actually data sharing and the ethics around data sharing. It's not that simple, like you often proclaim. Oh, even if you're using public data, I think the main focus of the talks here is already on reusing public data or producing data to be published inside experiments. And really, this was quite a journey, and I'm really happy that I'm today can have the session, have actually 3 people on stage, virtually on stage, actually only, that will help me going through the session. So I try to motivate everybody why we're doing this. I think I talked in the main session already about some of the ethics problems, but we're gonna deep dive. That's, I guess, the idea of the day today later with the speakers. So, like you said, we had actually it was 42. I always thought it was 40 data experiments. I didn't count them. It was very many, and a lot of hubs, and we were a reference. So what is the question? What reference do we provide you? So I think the biggest reference is you shouldn't be as naive as we were when we started. So we had a plan, we had a governance, like a project, and louder, okay. So yeah, it's a nice plan, it's a nice framework, it's a nice governance, but how do you really make that happen? So we also had processes, especially with experiments. Like it was said, we had planned a rigorous process on ethics checks, on data management checks, because it is a strict requirement when you're doing this, that you know what you're doing, and there are some principles that you need to follow. And yeah, that's how we started. And then actually what happens, kind of reality catches you. It's not as simple, I say. And I want to kind of use the opportunity to make kind of a little bit of advertisement for our first report on ethics and inside the project. It's published inside the blog of the EU-Obsoleta project site. So please look there to, if you like, an insight on all the different small problems we encountered when really looking in depth at the experiments and all the conflicts such experiments would create. So I have been talking before on kind of the things kind of where we are generating data, we are doing experimentation, and actually, to be honest, in a way that was the easier part of it. The more difficult part was actually often, especially for the SMEs, reusing the data. So this is the data catalog, and the nasty stuff comes in detail. So we have open data, which is personal data made by the subjects, or it's kind of no personal data, but then you're having links to personal data there. And in the end, it's kind of, who can we trust? Whose responsibility is that to make sure that all this metadata about kind of the liabilities and licenses is correct? And what we expect from the SMEs doing the stuff, using the data, is actually that they tracing the whole legitimacy of what they're doing back to the original data sources. And what we're discovering a lot is inconsistency along the passes and so on, which shouldn't be there. And can we really expect in every case that people really trust there? So, and how can we support them to actually find out what is out there? So I think findable, accessible, interoperable is kind of something that is solvable. The important thing is that certainly metadata is also accurate, and there's licenses, which is clear, and some provenance is already clear. But what are the relevant attributes, like from an ethical or legal perspective for the use case? And where is what kind of data is really domain relevant if you make those decisions?
Just to give you a short overview about the Startup Radar project in order to give you some context for the need of a legal analysis. First of all, the startup rather want to extract information about funding, mergers and acquisitions and product launches for the startups and other kind of organizations. And we get this from different open data sources like news, web monitoring of the corporative websites, etc. Secondly, through this knowledge of the startups, we aim to suggest similar startups to a given one, based mainly in their know-how and what they state about themselves. The alternatives in the market are not accurate enough so far, and we want to provide a precise recommender. And finally, we try to give human understandable explanations of why we are suggesting these similar companies by using the facts that we have been extracting in the initial steps. So due to the crawling and scrapping techniques that we use to get this data from different public data sources, we wanted to get professional advice about ethical and legal recommendations to follow. So this is the reason that we contacted with Patricia and her team. So Patricia will explain you the main points of this analysis.
Thank you. Yes, we did this experiment with Digigal, which is an initiative which aims to improve the competitiveness of the regional economy through the promotion of digital transformation and increase in the technology intensity of the industrial ecosystem. Digigal brings together and connects the technology demands. Large companies, but also SMEs and startups focus mainly on automotive, naval, textile, and food, and the technology supply. Digigal performs different services, and one of them was exactly this legal report, which results I'm going to present you now. So even though data scrapping is ubiquitous, its legal status remains unclear, as you know, and that's because whether data scraping is legal will depend on many aspects. Currently, as we will see, data scraping is legal in the EU, but its use is legally tricky also. The most important legal issues are related to copyright and data protection law. So before you jump into your daily dose of scraping, listen to the following recommendations that can save you from some nasty situations. It should be no surprise that scraping even publicly available data can infringe on intellectual property rights. Publicly available data is not publicly owned data. In fact, you could violate the author's right to its copyrighted text, even by reproducing just one sentence, if it's of particular originality. For that purpose, see this judgment by the Court of Justice of the European Union, which found that even an excerpt of 11 words might be protected. Moreover, in the EU, we have laws that provide a specific protection with regards to databases. To avoid problems connected with such protection, take into account the following factors. Basically, a database might be copyrighted if the structure of the database is an original intellectual creation. Clear? No, I know, neither for lawyers. The Court of Justice of the European Union in this judgment stated that the criterion of originality is satisfied when the author expresses his creative ability in an original manner by making free and creative choices through the selection or arrangement of the data. By contrast, the criterion is not satisfied when the setting up of the database is dictated by technical considerations, rules, or constraints, which leave no room for creative freedom. Clear? Well, it's extremely difficult to guess what a domestic court will say on the subject of the work's originality. Therefore, it's actually safer to assume that the database from which you are scraping is copyrighted. In this case, the scraping cannot lead to copying or republishing the original database's structure or a substantial part of it. But here we have some good news. You might be allowed to copy the database and use it for your own purposes, not republishing or selling, even if it's copyrighted, if your actions fall under the text and the data mining exception. What does it mean? Well, the EU recognizes the importance of protecting databases, but also of data mining activities. Europe considers itself a data-driven economy and acknowledges the current data revolution. Consequently, the European Union wishes to protect data mining and scraping, provided that they don't harm others, or at least not too much. The Digital Single Market Directive provides an exception from the rights of the database owner in case of reproduction and extraction of lawfully accessible works, such as publicly available data, for the purposes of data mining, unless the use of such works has been expressly reserved by the rights holders in an appropriate manner, such as machine-readable means in the case of content made publicly available online. Generally, then, this new directive allows for scraping, reproduction, and extraction of data from databases for the purpose of text and data mining, even if databases are granted copyright or sui generis protection. But remember that you are not allowed to further publish or sell such data. Anyway, this exception, this text and data mining exception, is limited. Database owners are granted the possibility to restrict the reproduction and extraction of databases and their content, but they must make it in a manner that allows bots and crawlers to see that restriction. Any such restriction must be respected, and scraping for scientific research purposes must always be permitted. Therefore, unless you copy, sell, or republish a lot of data, there is a great chance that you won't violate any copyright. From this perspective, then, reproduction of publicly available content is not illegal per se. But there are more traps in your way, and one of them is the possibility of breaching the website's terms of use if they prohibit web scraping. Should you, therefore, verify the terms and conditions of hundreds or thousands of websites? Well, that doesn't sound practical. The point is that to make you liable for such a breach, the website owner would have to prove that the contract was validly concluded. That's that the terms of use were validly accepted. Terms and conditions will generally be considered enforceable if they are agreed to by both parties, but domestic courts might use different criteria to determine whether such an agreement does in fact exist. A broad wrap agreement is generally considered insufficient. Courts have found that terms of use presented in this manner do not create an enforceable contract unless the website owner presents evidence that the user had actual or constructive knowledge of the terms. So most courts will ask for a click-wrap agreement, which requires the visitor to actively indicate agreement before accessing the information, typically presenting the terms and conditions followed by a checkbox with the words "I agree" or "I accept," and the user must click on that. Click-wrap agreements must still meet the criteria for enforceability for unilateral form contracts. Not all of their terms might be enforceable. And you can see here 6 components of an enforceable click-wrap agreement. Nevertheless, some national courts do not think there is a contract breach when terms of service are accepted but not respected, irrespective of what kind of agreement has been used. So the situation is highly uncertain. It's advisable to be careful and, if possible, rather avoid breaching terms of use made available in any form. Web scrapers that scrape personal data need to pay attention also to privacy laws. In the European Union, that would be in particular the General Data Protection Regulation. Contrary to common belief, the GDPR does not prohibit data scraping. However, you must follow its rules when mining personal data on the internet. Collecting data, forming a database, and then using this data for any purpose is data processing. Companies that cannot justify a legal ground for collecting and processing personal data shouldn't engage in the practice. There are 6 lawful bases available under the GDPR for the collection and processing of personal data: consent, contract with a data subject, compliance with a legal obligation, vital interest, public interest, legitimate interest. Consent is only one of several legal grounds to process personal data, rather than the main ground. Consent has an important role, but it doesn't exclude the possibility, depending on the context, of course, that other legal grounds might be more appropriate, either from the data scraping companies or from the data subject's perspective. But the availability of some of the other options may be limited. In most cases, the only
Patricia,
potential...
can you come to an end, because
Yes.
we're already a little bit over time, I think.
Yeah, the only potentially fitting lawful grounds for data scraping companies are consent, contract, and legitimate interests. But of course, you must still respect the GDPR requirements for processing data. Well, there are many other problems related to scraping, some of them related to the transfer of personal data outside the EU or trespass to chattels. But now, to minimize concerns, I can only say that you should, your scraping should be discreet, respect websites' terms of service, check whether sites are using the robots protocol to communicate that scraping is prohibited, avoid personal data scraping, and if necessary, make sure no GDPR violations are made, and avoid the scraping private or classified information. Data protection impact assessment could be always a good practice to follow. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So I actually thought of like having some questions, because I have a lot, but we are a little bit out of time. So maybe, I don't know, Charlie, if you're also there, so I have a last, maybe one single question to you.
Yes.
Kind of there. So like, as a question, can you now sleep better kind of with your company? Like after kind of looking towards this domain kind of from this aspects, and that somebody explained to you kind of the grounds on processing? Or was it like, yeah, I was pretty sure all the time that I could do it, and it would be okay because kind of everybody actually does it?
No, obviously we don't take the third-party data and just share it with our users. We use this data and analyze it with different tools that we have been creating to get trends and insight from this information. So from the beginning, we try to be ethical and legally using these data sources. So as we have been using new features to our tool, we always define them with this in mind. So we try to respect the terms of the services, following the GDPR rules. So we were not very worried, let's say, and we could sleep very well until this analysis. But obviously, it was helpful for us.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so you already presented me, thank you. And I am the data manager of the EU Apps for Data project. I'm Roberta Tura from Cineca, which is the high performance computing in Italy. And I will talk about problems and best practices on the data use from a data management plan perspective. So first of all, what is a data management plan? It's a document that describes how data collected, processed, or generated by EU-funded projects will be managed in order to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this is in order to support the research data lifecycle. That is, data that are collected, processed, analyzed, and then produce results inside a project, or in our case, an experiment, should not be wasted and should be made available, preserved and made available for further reuse in other research projects. And the document has a structure and has a template that the European Commission provides. And how did we implement it in our project? So in EU Apps for Data, data are actually used, collected, and generated by the experiments. And this is the reason why we ask to each experiment to produce its own data management plan and keep it updated for the duration of the experiment. And the process is that we provide the template to the SMEs, a template to enable them to describe each single data set that they are going to use or produce in their experiment. Then we collect the information at the midterm review and at the final review, and there is a process of evaluation that you will see in a few slides. So these are the templates that we actually used in the first and in the second open calls. There is an online tool that enables the filling of the information and the creation of the data management plan, which is Argos, that is provided by OpenAir. But they also have the possibility to use a table format for providing the information. So they can choose whether using the online tool or the provided table. And this is the timeline. So a first draft is produced at the beginning of the experiment. Then we have 2 releases at month 5 of the experiment and at the end of the experiment. And after the end of the experiment, the data sharing policies are being implemented. And regarding the evaluation, the review process takes into account the completeness of the description. So if all the data sets have been described, with the exception of the catalog data set, because we already know them, and also if all the sections of the template have been filled, and their coherence with the application form, because the application form contains a lot of information on the data that are going to be used in the experiment and that are going to produce. So these information are compared with the data management plan for any discrepancies, to check if there are any discrepancies. Then another important aspect to check if is any processing of personal data occurred, what are the data sharing policies and the potential fairness of the data that will be shared after the experiment. If some information are missing or are not coherent, we ask for integration. So it's an iterative process where we contact the SME in order to have a complete data management plan. And after the collection of all this information, we produce 2 summary tables, and one is by experiment, and you see the example on the right, and for the first 2 open calls. And these information are mainly the number of data sets that have been used from the catalog or from external providers, and the number of data sets that have been generated, and we produce statistics on them. Since the second open call experiments are still under evaluation, I don't have the final numbers, but for the first one, we had that 15 data sets were used from the catalog and 31 from external sources. And this is in the first graph representation. And regarding the data set generated by the experiment, there were 27 data sets generated. 9 of them were not going to be shared, so they were going to be kept closed, private. Another 9 data sets were openly shared, so openly accessible. They are openly accessible, and the remaining 9 were shared with the restrictions. But in the other table that is produced is by data set. So for each single data set, we register, we report the characteristic, the description, the size, the type of data, the format, and the purpose, why those data have been used, or the utility to whom they might be useful. And the link is provided because most of them are open, so usually the link is available. And we also assess the presence of personal data, what sharing policies are going to be implemented, the fairness of the generated data, and if there is any ethical issues. In the process of the evaluation, some issues came up, and these were mainly 2 kinds of issues. One kind of issue were related to the template. And this is because for the data set that are reused by the experiment, that are processed, there was a different interpretation. So some of the experiment declared that they were not going to be made fair. They were not going to be made findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Some other described how they're going to be made fair by the provider, or how they're going to be made fair by the SME during the experiment duration. So for a data set that already existed, it appeared that this template was a little bit misleading or even inappropriate, because how data are accessed is already decided and implemented by the provider, okay? Regarding data sets that were generated, these are the results of the experiment and should be shared as much as possible, but some experiments are not willing to share the generated data sets for commercial or privacy reasons. So in this case also, the FAIR section was inappropriate. And so to summarize, we have 2 kinds of data set, reused by the experiment or generated. And we have 2 different objectives of the data management plan depending on these 2 typologies. In the first case, the data management plan is useful to ensure proper reuse of the processed data. So to assess that the SME was entitled to use those data. And in the second case, the main purpose of the data management plan is to promote reuse of the generated data, reuse of the results. So we have 2 different objectives depending on the typology of data sets, but we only have 1 template. So what we did for the third open call is to produce a template with a clear indication that the yellow part, which is the FAIR section, should only be completed if the data set is generated by the experiment and there is the willingness to share those data. They still will have in the third open call the possibility to use the OpenAIRE Argos tool. In this case, questions regarding the first section are many, and they will have to skip them themselves. And the other kind of issues that came up in the evaluation of the data management plan are related to the content and mainly are incomplete information. So in many cases, there were incomplete information and inconsistencies due to low awareness of the data management plan concepts. In some cases, they didn't know what metadata are, for example. And another problem was the reticence. We had vague or cryptic descriptions when data sets are going to be kept closed, mainly. So due to business or commercial or confidentiality reasons. In this case, very limited information was provided. Another issue is that the sharing policies are not always implemented. And this is because the data management plan is a plan and it changes over time, and it may change even after the end of the project. So even if the experiment described that they will share the generated data, they may not know how to do it, or even if instructed or supported in the information on how to do it, they will not implement they will not upload the data to the external repositories. So there is not much to do, because we cannot chase them after the end of the project or force them to publish the data. Another problem was the data quality. So in one case in particular, the data set was published and was completely fair, was findable, accessible, and so on, but the quality of data was very poor. And since in that case, the synthetic data had been generated, we asked them to provide a description in order to make those data really reusable, a description of the process of generation of the data. And it came out that it was just a random number that had been generated, so basically unuseful. So this is another problem, because even if a question is in the template and it is quality assurance described, the data quality assurance process, usually there is not a quality assurance process, so this can be an issue, and we should pay attention to that. Other problem regarded the personal data, and in some cases there is the assumption that anonymized data are not personal. This is not the case. Anonymized data are still personal data, and this came out because in the data management plan it was declared that they were not going to use personal data, but in the application form the anonymization was mentioned. So in this case, we investigate further with the SME in order to understand if personal data are involved, and that there is no, that the personal data are protected anyway. And also lack of consent for using proprietary data set for other purposes was one of the issues that came out. And these are the lessons learned, and first of all, simplify the template, ask the right question. A detailed template is still necessary in order to have all the information, but it should be customized in order to be appropriate for the typology of data set. And also to train the SMEs and the DIHs on the ethical data management would enable the awareness of all the concepts and a correct filling of a correct generation of the data management plan itself. So training is important, but there is a time issue and effort issue, so it is not always possible. And to collect the feedback from the DIHs on issues regarding the data set during the regular advanced meeting in order not to rely only on the SME's description. So thank you very much for the attention, and